Well, hey, everybody, welcome to a Friday night live show. This was rather impromptu. It has been an absolutely bonkers travel month, if you haven't noticed by all the videos on the channel and, of course, on Facebook. So just tried to squeeze this one in while we can. Nick is off filming the car du jour. Travis is off doing something else up in the Pacific Northwest. And Alexandra actually has 2 weeks off, if you believe it or not. She's our intrepid editor that does all of the editing for all the videos. So if by chance you notice that videos over the next month might be, I don't know, a little sparse or a little funky here and there, that's because Alexandra was not able to do her usual touches on the videos. So sorry about that. Let's just sort of dive into the questions here. The first one is Civic Hybrid related, which is interesting. Let's see. They were not overly specific. This is an excellent question here. Honda did not say whether the pre-refresh Civic had active noise control. I actually thought it did. We don't know a lot of details, and Honda has been, by the way, pretty sketchy on the details. We don't know pricing. We can read between the lines, but they did not actually say in the press release that this was the 2-liter hybrid system. I actually got that out of the PR folks that were there. So there are a few things that are still left to dribble out. We know that there's going to be a launch drive program coming up soon that we are not able to attend, I believe, but there'll be a different drive program a little bit later that we will be able to attend at that point in time. So let's move on to the next question here. Just thanks to everybody following us over on Facebook. If you haven't found us over there, thanks for the folks that are on Facebook. And I will say that Facebook is a great place to interact with the entire team when we're out filming vehicles, because the questions and comments we often get over there do help inform the final video that ends up on YouTube. So good reason to find us over there. One good example actually is that Alexandra and I were recently out in Spain filming the Polestar 3 and Polestar 4. And we were posting pictures earlier in the day, and we had a lot of folks ask questions that we hadn't really thought of at the time. So those did end up in the video. Here we go. Here is a lovely question on our Grenadier. It's lovely. I still love the Grenadier. It did have a leak, so it has finally come back from its leak fix. This has been something apparently that a lot of Grenadiers in the early production window for North America had. And pardon me. I'm not quite sure whether it was North American specific or this actually affected other market Grenadiers, but the drain tubes for the Safari windows, apparently something in the fixturing in the factory seemingly got them to get crushed and maybe had a hole in them somewhere. So we actually had water dripping onto the dashboard in the rain. They fixed that. It's back and doesn't leak. So other than that, absolutely no issues at all. Moving along, this is actually something that we also had going on. We had an order on the EX30 as well. I am not sure whether or not we will end up getting the the EX30, or whether we'll maybe get something different. There's a lot of geopolitical uncertainty about cars that are going to be built permanently in China. So I'm not quite clear what the viewers think and whether we should get a Polestar 3 or not, or an EX30 or not. I'm a little unclear on that one. But solid choice going with the Model Y there. Kevin actually has a really good question here on Apple CarPlay, and this is one that I think GM has had some really bad PR around. GM is not ditching CarPlay in anything that runs on gasoline or diesel. CarPlay is still going to be around for that entire product line: SUVs, pickup trucks, cars, everything. The only vehicles where CarPlay is getting deleted is in their electric vehicles, and that's everything produced basically Blazer onwards. So we have CarPlay, very strangely, in the Silverado work truck, but not the consumer Silverado. We have it in the Cadillac Lyriq, but not the Cadillac Optiq. We don't have it in the Blazer or the Equinox EVs, and every other EV going forward, it's not going to have CarPlay. There are a number of reasons for that. I would say that most of them are either BS or they're just not good reasons, to be honest, from GM. The main reason that they're doing this is that they want your navigation data, and logically, they want to help sell subscriptions for the ongoing connectivity services in the vehicle. I would assume that if there's a lot of customer backlash and maybe a loss in sales to other manufacturers, that they might chart a different course. But at the moment, that they seem pretty firm on this course. I will say that if you are a fan of CarPlay, there are a lot of other options out there. Tesla, of course, and Rivian are also not doing CarPlay in their vehicles. They seem pretty steadfast in that, but Ford really on board with CarPlay, and they're taking CarPlay to the next level with Apple smartphone integration with CarPlay on there. Let's move along to the next question here from Max A. My wife and I are considering the new Kia Carnival. Any news on a press release for that? There have actually been a number of announcements on the Carnival already. We have a video on the channel. For the Carnival, 2025 Carnival and Carnival Hybrid. Hopefully we'll be driving them over the next few months. It's a pretty incremental refresh. Basically, they just stuck the hybrid system from a few other vehicles, jammed into the hood of the Carnival, and they adjusted the styling here and there. So the bulk of the vehicle is the same. All of the previous video content that we've done on it concerning cargo capacity, passenger carrying capacity, etc., that all applies directly to the 2025 Carnival. I am not sure what the fuel economy in the real world will be like with that hybrid system in a vehicle the size of the Carnival, but it's been a pretty reliable and pretty fuel efficient hybrid system in the other vehicles it's been in. So I would expect somewhere around 30 miles per gallon. I would assume that fuel economy is probably going to be a little bit below the Pacifica plug-in hybrid, and probably similar or just slightly below the Sienna hybrid. The Sienna hybrid, actually, no one that I know of has really been able to get consistent high fuel economy scores close to the EPA estimate on that one. I know that all the major publications where we all do our own fuel economy test loops, we've all scored below the EPA score in the Sienna. A little bit different than the Highlander and Grand Highlander, which generally achieve their numbers. So certainly keep that in mind. Let's move on here. Won't GM let users tether internet from your phone like Polestar? It does sound like GM will not have any changes to the way that internet access is done in their electric vehicles. It's simply that they don't want people navigating with CarPlay or Android Auto on their phones, because if you are navigating through the in-house navigation system, you are explicitly allowing GM to have access to all of that data. This has been so a lot of questions around this. The question of, isn't GM tracking you anyway? Well, by the terms and conditions of OnStar, yes, if you hit the button, they're tracking you, but they aren't just tracking you, generally speaking, just daily driving situations like that. There is a bit of uncertainty around exactly how much data and what kind of data they're hoovering up from just general OnStar use. But we know that explicitly, if you're navigating in the infotainment system, it seems like those user agreements, they are allowing you, or allowing GM rather, to have access to that navigation data and the consumption data. So they know how you went, how fast you went there, how much energy it took to get you there and back, etc. So that helps them create better route planning in the future. Basically, the same thing that we see from Tesla. This is the reason that Tesla, of course, doesn't do CarPlay and Android Auto as well. And that's also why in modern Teslas, the range estimation has become really, really accurate. And it's also the reason that range estimation is not accurate at all in vehicles that don't do that kind of data aggregation and collection. So take a look at, for instance, the Hyundai Kia Genesis EVs. Range estimation is really not good in the native nav software. It does some estimations, but it's not overly accurate, and it doesn't update with time because they're not doing that same kind of data collection, aggregation, and online range calculations. So if you're at all concerned about data privacy, you might want to skew towards the vehicles that don't require subscriptions, have built-in navigation databases that don't do that kind of range estimation. On the other hand, you're just it's not going to get good range estimation. So there's kind of the double-edged sword there. Luke is asking about the Equinox EV. I am really intrigued about this, and I would love to know everybody's thoughts on a vehicle like the Equinox EV. The big thing there is the price point. It is really inexpensive, $28,000 approximately for the base version. And even though there is some decontenting going on in the base version, it's not as much as a lot of folks had really thought. The base version of the Equinox EV is going to get the same 319 miles of range, the same electric motor that we find in the upper end trims. It's going to get LED headlights. It's also going to get, of course, the active safety suite that's standard on the vehicle. Now, you are, of course, not going to get power seats or leather upholstery or anything like that. But I think that it comes across as really well featured. It also is surprisingly roomy inside. For a customer that looks for, or is looking rather for, an inexpensive vehicle that has the tax credit if you're going to buy it outright, has tax credits offered on a lease, and of course has point of sale credits available, then this is going to be a really solid option. Also surprising, GM says that even though they're not going to predict what the tax credit situation will be like next year in 2025, they say that they have deliberately targeted all the Ultium supply chains from the very beginning to exclude the countries of concern. I was really intrigued by that. They, of course, wouldn't comment directly, but off the record, they felt pretty confident that those tax credits would continue in 2025. So lots to really like about that Equinox EV. And I would say to anybody that's saying, why not get the Model Y because it's only, $10,000 more expensive? Isn't it a better vehicle? I would say yes, Model Y is absolutely a better vehicle. You get all-wheel drive, you get better performance, all of that, faster charging, but it's also 10 grand more expensive. Keep that in mind. So all content in base model to base model, including destination and any purchase charges, etc., you're going to be significantly less expensive in the Equinox. And if you can afford a Model Y, great for you. Go ahead and buy the Model Y. But keep in mind that when we're talking about a leap from $27,000 up to $37,000, that's a pretty big difference in monthly payment and affordability. And the Equinox is likely going to be less expensive to insure, less expensive to repair, just because of the design of the vehicle and the way that GM does mass market designs, etc. Let's move along here. And, Drew, I cannot speak exactly to Polestar 3 and 4 yet because that's under embargo, but you can check out our first look videos on 3 and 4. And I will say that without breaking the embargo, that Polestar 3 comes across as more fully baked, I guess you could say, than Polestar 4. Polestar 4 is a little further away from going on sale. That's pretty logical. And the two vehicles are not related. So exactly what the final fully baked product will be like, you honestly are going to have to wait until I can drive one in the US. The models that we were driving in Europe were European intended models and very, very early pre-production prototypes. They were not final production vehicles. So obviously there will be differences between that. Moving on to Mark Thomas, my next EV replacement for my John Deere. I am actually kind of intrigued that there aren't more electric options for, heavy equipment and tractors, etc. Fun fact, I just bought myself a used Bobcat tracked skid steer. So fun times in that one. More content to come there. Uh, Tariffs. This is an interesting one, BJB. Most likely, yes. I've had a lot of questions about this and a lot of conspiracy theories swirling around U.S. tariffs. I'm just going to call the trade agreement currently in existence NAFTA because that's what everybody calls it. But it is not. It is actually the U.S. Mexico Canada trade agreement, blah, blah, blah. Any rate, NAFTA was actually effectively replaced by a new agreement that had some extra protections for labor laws, and some extra doodads tacked on to the basic NAFTA framework. But in essence, NAFTA is still there. And this is the important part. If you are a foreign company and you want access to tariff-free trade with the US, the easy answer is build a factory in Mexico, build a factory in Canada. And we know this works because this is not these companies' first rodeos. And while there haven't been that many car companies seeking to evade tariffs, we do know that there are a lot of other industries that are avoiding tariffs in this way. And of course, inside the car world, there are companies building vehicles in Mexico. For instance, there are some European companies with Mexican factories, and there are definitely some Japanese car companies with factories and production in Mexico as well. And then obviously there are all the North American car companies that are building a whole lot of stuff in Mexico because labor is cheaper there. And that's why we've seen a lot of migration of production that direction. These exact same tools can be done without tariffs and without penalties in Mexico as well. But it's not simply that they will prop up a car company and send over kits from China to Mexico. Things like that would violate the law. Also, there are additional tariffs on extrusions in final products and other metal forming components, etc. So keep in mind, this is not Chinese company knocking a kit down, assembling it in Mexico, and have access to the North American market tariff-free. But they could source the extrusions from North America, which would include Mexico, of course, because Mexico is in North America. Actually, fun fact, everything from Panama all the way on up is in North America. At any rate, geography lesson over. Sourcing all the components from the right place, assembled in Mexico, built in Mexico, etc., but Chinese owned, that's not a problem. And that's definitely a way to escape the tariffs. Geopolitical differences aside, I will let you all decide whether that's a good or a bad thing, but that should not be an intrinsic problem. Moving back over to Facebook, Kevin's asking, some car makers are starting to put rear turn signals at the bottom of the bumper, not at eye level. They don't like the look. What's up with this? There are a few different answers to this particular question. Some car companies have said that lower mounted lights have greater visibility. That would depend on the kind of vehicle you are following the other car in, but I see some of the logic. So if you're in heavy fog, then you are going to get greater visibility on those lamps if they're placed lower, a little bit better clarity. Other car companies say that they reduce the visual bulk of the rear end. So car companies are trying to decide, what should the rear end look like? Should we have the look lower? Should we have that look high, etc.? So there are a few different factors involved. And then some car companies are going after low-placed light elements because they really want a large hatch in the back. So think something like the Chevy Bolt and the Bolt EUV. Those lights are placed quite low in the body, or they'll have repeater lights down low in the body because if they're on the hatch and the hatch opens, you have to have a second element anyway. So the way to reduce cost is to simply have the lighting element low on the bumper, and then it's in compliance and it doesn't move. Something like the Hyundai Santa Fe with that really low-waisted look, that was definitely just a style exercise, and they were pretty clear on that one. Let's move along to another question here on Prologue versus Equinox EV. This one I think is a really good one. I really love the look of the Prologue, and I would love to know what you all think about the look of Prologue versus Equinox down there in the comment section. Just type away. Maybe we'll hold a poll later. But big reasons to get the Honda are obviously Honda dealers are better rated than Chevy dealers. I think that's a pretty easy thing to say. Regardless of the dealership survey we're talking about, seems like Honda dealers generally are rated better for customer service and all of that. So you can buy the vehicle at a better dealer. I think the Prologue looks better, to be honest, to my eye. I like the exterior design. On the inside, I think the Equinox looks a bit better, however. I like the bigger screens and the dashboard design in the Chevy, but the Honda has another advantage, and that is Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. And this is the way we know that the electronics in the Equinox could work with CarPlay and Android Auto if Chevy wanted to. They could literally release a software update tomorrow for smartphone integration. They choose not to. And we know that because it's in the Honda Prologue, and the hardware is exactly the same. So let me know what you think about that. Let's see here. Will used EVs help buck the European maintenance cost concern? I would argue, Paul, no, because the maintenance that does exist, especially people that take their vehicles back to the dealer, those maintenance costs will still be high. And any repairs that you do need to have done in your European EV will obviously generally be more expensive than in a Japanese or an American EV, although it will probably help level the playing field because you will not have as much regular maintenance to worry about. I will say, on the other hand, that most European EVs, or sorry, most European vehicles, period, not EVs specifically, but most European vehicles include 3 to 4 years of scheduled maintenance with the purchase of the vehicle. So depending on exactly what you're doing with your European car, it may not actually make too much difference. And that's why when you take a look at some of the near and short-term maintenance estimates out there for new vehicles, you'll notice that BMW, Mercedes, Volvo, Audi, etc., they actually place quite low in the anticipated maintenance costs and repair costs in the short term because it's included. So if you were to, for instance, buy or lease a Chevy and it's a $100,000 Chevy, say it's a truck, really high level, high trim Silverado or Sierra, and you were to compare that to an $80,000 or $90,000 BMW, over 3 years, you should expect to pay more on maintenance on the Chevy than on the BMW, simply because that maintenance is included in the cost of your BMW. But outside of that 3-year window, say you keep your car for 5 years or 7 years, the next 2 years, the BMW is likely to have much higher maintenance costs because every trip to the dealer is going to be more expensive. Higher wages there, more expensive parts, more expensive filters, etc. In some vehicles in the luxury segment, especially if you're looking at a vehicle with a really nice wet dual clutch transmission like we find in the Audi lineup often, those have relatively expensive fluid and filter changes right outside the average lease window. So generally around year 4 or year 5. And that will really cause those maintenance costs to go up significantly over a lot of the domestic competition. Let's see here. This is an excellent question I would love to know the answer to as well. When will we be driving the Volvo EX90? I will say that since we recently drove the Polestar 3, that we're probably about 3 to 6 months out from driving the EX90, but Volvo really won't say on production timing there. The Polestar 3 and EX90 both had some production delays that were never fully explained. It seems to mainly be software. And that's probably why Polestar 3 is not going to be getting CarPlay right at launch. So they were prioritizing some of the software updates and software changes that needed to be done on the vehicle, and it seems like that got on the back burner. So CarPlay is going to happen via an over-the-air update sometime within the first few months of ownership. It seems that by the time production moves to South Carolina for the Polestar 3, that they will be back with CarPlay again, but details remain a little uncertain there. Let's move along here. Do customers really listen to customers, or do they just pretend? I would argue that they definitely do listen to customers. There's a lot of time spent that I've spent actually with every car company out there going over, what do consumers say they want, whether that's in a focus group or whether it's customer surveys, etc. I will say that if you really want to give feedback to car manufacturers, fill out the surveys that come after you've purchased the vehicle. Some car companies will survey you directly, but most car companies actually depend on third-party surveys. So these can be research groups like MorePace. They can be JD Power surveys. JD Power is probably the biggest survey that customers really can put a lot of feedback into car companies. JD Power is really often misunderstood in the industry, I would say. there's this pervasive belief that their surveys are purchased and that the awards are bought, etc. That's absolutely not true. But JD Power is a survey and information loop mechanism back into the car manufacturer. So when car companies are looking at what do we do in a refresh of the product, JD Power surveys influence that. And we can really see that in vehicles like the Chevy truck lineup, where they really tried to respond quickly to the interior deficiencies in this last full generation of the truck lineup. Of course, it was impacted by COVID, so that emergency refresh turned into almost a normal refresh cycle. But it was initiated by the first 90-day surveys from customers where they were looking at them and customers didn't like the interior design. They thought it wasn't quite what they wanted. So moving along from there, the orange is asking, would you consider PHEV focused videos? I think we are definitely going to be doing more of that content at the moment. Every time we've kind of looked into doing more PHEV videos, in my mind, it seems like they often come back to Korean videos, which seem to generate a lot of anti-Korean or just not necessarily anti-Korean sentiment, but just it appears that we're very biased because there's so many reviews of Korean plug-in hybrid vehicles, but it's simply because that's where all the plug-in hybrids are at the moment. Hyundai and Kia specifically really were aggressive at rolling out a ton of plug-in hybrids, whereas other car companies were not quite sure where the legislative landscape would go. And I was recently talking to someone from GM about this actually, and they basically said that they saw the legislative landscape shifting in the United States and really pushing hard on full EVs. And they felt that that would put plug-in hybrids at a disadvantage. And if they put too many eggs in that basket, then they would be penalized by some of the legislation going on. Also, they disliked the way that California and some of the ZEV states would be treating plug-in hybrids going forward. So basically, in the before times, plug-in hybrids were treated exactly like electric cars. But that's not the most rational thing since they still burn some gasoline. So over time, California and the states that follow California's ZEV mandate, they've tweaked that system around the edges. And plug-in hybrids don't get all the same credits that EVs got. They get more credits than a regular hybrid, but not quite full credit, if you will. And that, I think, has influenced some manufacturers' decisions around this. But we are seeing a general backing off of that and a little bit more investment into hybrids and plug-in hybrids. So I think that will change in the years coming forward. It looks like we had a record hybrid sales year in 2023. It was a huge number. Over 2 million hybrids were sold. And in 2024, by the end, I suspect we actually could be close to 3 million hybrids sold in the United States, mainly because manufacturers like Toyota have been very aggressive at making the Camry all hybrid. We're going to be seeing more of a hybrid split in the next generation RAV4. We don't know whether it's going all hybrid or whether it's just going to be heavily hybrid, but either direction, it's going to be more hybrids than we had before. Honda is also making more hybrids standard across the lineup. And we have manufacturers like Stellantis that have actually been pretty aggressive at hybridization and plug-in hybridization. For instance, the Ram 1500, of course, has the mild hybrid system standard. We also find a mild hybrid in things like the Mazda CX90. So hybrids are definitely moving along, depending on exactly how you want to categorize some of those hybrid systems. Let's moving on here to, this is actually a really good question here. Nils is asking about plug-in hybrids and EVs and air conditioners and heat pumps here. There is actually more going on to create a heat pump from an air conditioning than simply an extra valve. However, it is relatively inexpensive relatively uncomplicated as far as the transition goes. Expense, though, is the main reason. It's been difficult to get good numbers on exactly how much more a heat pump is in a passenger vehicle than an air conditioning, but there is an extra expense involved. And so that seems to be the main reason that we haven't seen car companies do this. There's also a little bit of a packaging concern because the valving, the slightly different design to the evaporator and the condenser also occupy a little bit of extra room inside the cabin. And more importantly, on most of the heat pump equipped vehicles, choosing between a air to water heat pump and then back to air. So basically, are we adding an extra loop in there, and are we heating the water loop in the vehicle, which would be required to heat the battery, for instance, with the heat pump? Are we going to do that, or are we simply going to have an air to air source heat pump to heat the cabin? These are all decisions that manufacturers are looking through, and some manufacturers are going on one side or the other. It does seem to make sense to include a fluid loop in your heat pump loop, because then you can use that to heat the battery. You can also use the heat pump to effectively pull heat out of other sources, out of the battery, out of the motor cooling circuits, etc. So there's extra valving and extra coolant loops, etc., that can be involved if you're going to bother going down the heat pump route. And that, in the end, can make it more expensive. But exactly how the manufacturers decide to do this varies from manufacturer to manufacturer. Let's moving on here. Yep, this is a good point, actually. The Silverado is quite heavy. So apparently in Quebec, it requires a heavy L plate. That's a problem that we're actually going to be seeing, I think, a lot more of as we see more and more big battery truck and full-size SUV EVs out there. Concerns around how are we licensing these? What requirements are we going to have in parking structures in rural areas where we have private bridges, things like that? You can end up in situations where the weight is a concern. But exactly what that looks like long term, I think it's a little too early to tell. Let's moving along here. Are we going to do a full review on our off-grid system with the Chevy Bolt small battery? It would be great to see if we had more things like that. The our home off-grid system, we've done a few videos on it. I don't know if there's a huge amount of general interest on that sort of topic. A lot of people end up in off-grid living for various reasons that don't necessarily apply to our situation. We decided to go off-grid primarily because power is really unreliable where we are in the redwood forest, and we figured if we're going to do something like a large backup generator and enough storage for a day or two or a week or two off grid, because bear in mind that we have had weeks over the last few years where weeks have turned into multiple weeks without utility power. Then we thought, we might as well go down this solar route so that we don't have to run the generator all the time. We don't have to get diesel to the generator or worry about how do we get propane. We don't have natural gas service. So there is a question of how do we fill this thing. And even though in the winter when this occurs, you're not getting a lot of sun, there is usually enough sun, even when it's raining, to run the essentials. If you could shut everything down, you could still, flush the toilet when you needed to flush the toilet. You could still have a light on. You could still run the TV when you needed to, that sort of thing, at a bare minimum. And then everything on top of that is gravy. So that's how we ended up on the solar off grid there. I know other people in our area that ended up off grid because they simply didn't want to pay PG&E, because it can be pretty expensive to run utility power to a new home, especially if you're really far from the nearest utility connection. So things like easements and actually running the power, those can get pretty expensive. You might as well just spend the money on an off-grid system. And then, of course, there are other reasons that people move off-grid that, you can all do your own fun research on. Let's moving on here. Thoughts on Tesla laying off their entire supercharger team, putting a pause on future supercharger development. I think that was a really bad decision. And, I don't seek to make windows into people's souls or understand exactly what's going on inside Tesla. I will say that there has been some decent reporting that maybe this was a knee-jerk reaction and maybe Elon overreacted. Again, I don't know what that situation looks like in there. Maybe he honestly thought that the supercharger network was big enough and they didn't need any more. I would lean towards maybe it being a irrational decision, and I really wonder. I'm a little bit more concerned maybe for Tesla financially. What does this mean to the future adoption of J3400 and other manufacturers' deals to work with Tesla on this? I would assume, no one wants to talk about details, but I would assume that Ford, GM, and Rivian, et cetera, they're all paying Tesla something for access to the supercharger network, and getting other manufacturers to do that and get on board with that and help pay for the supercharger network, I would assume that would be dependent on it continuing to grow. So I see that as a bit of a PR problem, maybe. Let's see here. Moving on. Is Ford best positioned in the next 3 to 5 years to try and catch Tesla? This is a really interesting question. I don't know whether it's going to be Ford or another car company, but I would assume that if I had to bet on one car company catching Tesla or trying to catch Tesla, I actually don't know if it would be Ford. Ford has put a lot of money on Lightning and a lot of money on Mach-E, and I think they did both products really, really well. But we don't see a deep pipeline of products at Ford, at least not yet. We have the rumors of the upcoming Explorer EV. We see one in Europe. It's a joint venture with Volkswagen, but we don't see a series of joint ventures or a lot of new product on the immediate horizon. If I were to put money on a car company, I would actually think it's going to be the Hyundai Kia conglomerate, because not only do we have a lot of product already, we see a lot of product in the pipeline and a willingness to spend a lot of money on the products and on pretty major refreshes. For instance, the Ioniq 5 already got a refresh. It's not a major refresh, but it did get one. It got some updated battery tech as well. We are seeing a refreshed EV6 in really short order as well. Already rumor mills swirling in Korea. We know what the Korean one looks like. So we see that this manufacturer is not only producing lots of models, but they're really ramping production up. They're also being pretty aggressive at pricing, and they're building a factory in North America to be building the vehicles in. That's probably their most important thing, is where are they spending their money? The Korean car companies, they were really caught off guard by the requirement that in order to get the tax credit, the vehicles be built in North America. But we saw them really accelerating their plans to move production to the US for some of these models, so that way they'll continue qualifying for the EV tax credit here. Now, moving up here, MSync is asking about those EV tax credits. I would say that the EV tax credit on a lease, it could be important if you want to purchase the vehicle afterwards. Otherwise, it's simply a matter of lease rate. Whether or not the lease credit is given doesn't really matter. The lease rate is actually most important. Drew was saying, shout out to Mercedes-Benz for using amber turn signals in all their vehicles. I would say, unfortunately, Mercedes doesn't use ambers in all of their vehicles, although they do use them in most, thankfully. I do like their taillight designs, but some of them, unfortunately, they moved to red turn signals. And that's mainly a style thing. A lot of car companies think that customers actually want red turn signals. I don't understand that. I don't know anybody that actually says, yes, I want a turn signal that's harder to understand. Let's move along here. And Miguel is considering a used Camry or Accord hybrid. Price-wise, they're about the same. Which one would I recommend? I would generally recommend the Toyota hybrid system as far as reliability, longevity, and fuel economy performance, but I would recommend the Honda for driving and general style. I like the style and the ride of the Honda Accord a little bit better. And some of this is going to depend on the kind of driving you do. If you live in an area with higher speed limits, especially areas like Texas, or if you just like to speed, you're going to get better fuel economy in the Camry, notably, versus the Accord. At around 65 miles an hour, 55 to 65, the two vehicles are actually very, very similar, but at higher speeds, you are definitely going to notice that the Camry is more efficient. Let's moving on here to Luke's question about the lease loophole. The lease loophole exists for every EV out there, and it's actually, I think, a little bit misunderstood here, so let's dive into it a bit deeper. It's not specifically a lease loophole. It's the reality that corporate EV purchases get the tax credit anyway. So, for instance, if you have a small company and you want to buy a fuel-efficient vehicle, a green vehicle for your next company car, whether that's for deliveries, etc., you will get the tax credit on that, whether or not it's tax credit eligible, whether or not you lease it or not. So if you're an S corporation, an LLC, a C corporation, etc., and you buy a Mitsubishi Outlander plug-in hybrid, or you buy a Mercedes-Benz EV that's built outside the United States, etc., or even an EV built in China, interestingly enough, then you will get the full tax credit on that vehicle, whether it's a plug-in hybrid or an EV or a fuel cell vehicle, regardless of country of manufacture, because you're a corporation. And because of that, and because leasing companies are corporations, and because the leasing company is holding the title for that EV, they get the tax credit as well. Now, here's the important loophole condition. The leasing company that is buying that EV has to have a tax liability in order for this to work. And then they have to choose to pass it along to you. Now, remember that not all companies pay taxes. And what I mean by that is if you're a subsidiary of a larger corporation, so say you're Ford Motor Credit, this is not an indication of how Ford does business, mind you. This is simply an example. But say Ford Motor Credit is the leasing company you have chosen. Well, Ford Motor Credit may not actually pay taxes in their own right. They may actually just be sucked up and put up under the parent company for taxation purposes. So it may just all get rolled up and Ford pays taxes. But the way that the tax system works, not all of those credits are always able to be moved up to the next entity in a corporate structure like this. And that's why not every company out there will pass along those leasing tax credits. There are lists out there where you can see which companies do and which companies don't. Important thing is that not all companies do. However, on a lease, I would say that doesn't necessarily matter as much as the actual lease rate. So for a leasing customer, unless you plan on buying the car after the term of the lease, the actual monthly payment is what's most important. So just look at the monthly payment, decide whether you like A or B or C, go with that. If, however, you're looking at the lease loophole as a way to lower the cost of a purchase and you are planning on buying the vehicle after the lease is over, then just take a look at all the details on the lease. Not all leases will allow you to buy the vehicle after the term of the lease, interestingly enough. Some leases will have additional fees in order for you to buy the vehicle out. Some leases will make you go back to the dealer to do it. Some will let you transact directly with the leasing company. There is a lot of variation on board. So all of those details are important to keep in mind. Let's move along here. And Tyrannical is asking, we've been looking at the Korean compact SUVs and the Mazda CX-50. Which has better value, in your opinion, at 1 to 2 levels above the base trim? I would say both are really good values, especially in those mid-level trims. But I would say that my award pick for value, especially in the mid-level trims, would probably be the Kia or the Hyundai. They're going to have a longer warranty, whether or not that is of value to you. And I also think that, especially in the mid-level trims, the suspension is just more elegantly done than in the Mazda CX-50. This is something that we wouldn't normally have said about Kia and Hyundai 10 years ago, for instance. Hyundai and Kia were not known for their suspension tuning and their suspension refinement historically, but they have hired a boatload of European suspension designers and moved them all to Korea. And they've really spent a lot of time focusing on driving dynamics. That's part of why Albert Biermann and a lot of the team from BMW actually ended up over at Hyundai and Kia. They're all getting old and retiring now, but they've left a lot of their legacy behind. And that's also why we see things like fully independent suspensions in most of the Korean vehicles, where we didn't necessarily find that in the past. And I think a lot of that has really helped their driving dynamics. At Mazda, we actually see a little bit of the reverse. We actually see a little bit of backsliding in a way, because the CX-50, the Mazda 3, etc., they don't have a fully independent rear suspension. They also generally tend to have much narrower tires than a lot of the competition. There are logical reasons for this. Mazda is a very small car company, very, very small, mind you. And that means that there aren't the same kind of resources that they once had when they were part of a larger conglomerate, back when they were tied with Ford, for instance. A lot of the heyday that I think a lot of Americans think of when we think of Mazda and their fantastic driving dynamics, that was in an era where Mazda was tied with Ford and they could pull on the European side of Ford, which is definitely known for solid driving small cars. They also had the ability to go to Volvo and design car platforms with Volvo and borrow suspension geometry and suspension consulting experience from these other portions of the larger company. But now we see Mazda very much on their own, and we see, we see not necessarily a loss of that same experience, but we just see a reality when it comes to budget. The people at Mazda are still very focused on driving precision and driving dynamics, but there is a reality that it has to fit in the budget. They have to be able to afford the research and development. and they can't have access. They don't have access to the same level of engineering talent maybe that they once did. And I think that's, rather unfortunate. We also see them needing to have high fuel economy numbers because they don't have hybrids that they have in-house developed, with rare exceptions. We're going to see some upcoming hybrids in some vehicles like the CX-50 in conjunction with Toyota for that hybrid. We also see the mild hybrid in the CX-90 and the plug-in hybrid there that are really helping out their numbers. But the bulk of their sales volume is not in hugely efficient vehicles that are really helping their legislative requirements. So that's why we don't have high performance Mazdas really anymore. We don't have really wide tires because they have to fit all of their vehicles into the fuel economy standards that we have now. So for mainstream vehicles in the lower end trims, I think there's a lot to really love there. But if you're looking at the top end trims or the upper mid level trims, and especially if you're waxing poetic about what I would say would be the heyday of Mazda, unfortunately, that's just not the 21st century world that we live in now. Moving along back to Luke here. Thanks for the super chat here. Please talk about the Canadian market for EVs, no tariffs and huge subsidies. The Canadian market is really interesting for a number of reasons, I think personally, because it's so small, but it's also an interesting microcosm because there are a lot of synergies between the car market in California and Canada and Europe, but obviously they're all different, but there is a certain synergy between these three regions. Canada obviously has a stronger push nationally towards electrification and emissions reduction than we see in the bulk of the United States, but not quite as aggressive, I would argue, as California. But in Canada, there is more of a willingness to accept smaller vehicles, smaller physical vehicles, more rational vehicles, I would argue, to be perfectly honest. Not everybody needs a huge battery. So there's a pragmatism in that market that I think is good for the future of electrification. But we don't necessarily know where this is going to go because the Canadian car market and the American car market are so intrinsically linked together. FMVSS, the Federal Motor Vehicle Standard, is effectively the same standard that Canada uses for safety, for crash structures, for headlight and taillight legislation, etc. So because of the harmonization of these two markets and design, historically, because Canada's market is so much smaller, we don't necessarily see the ability for wacky, inexpensive Chinese cars to simply come easily to market in Canada, because they would still have to meet a lot of the same homologation standards to be sold in Canada. Now, there are more avenues for reduced legislative requirements and compliance in Canada. That's why we saw things like the Nissan Micra in Canada that never made it to the US. And we do see occasional trims here of vehicles and specific models that will make it their way to Canada, not to the US, even though there is some compliance that has to be done for certain low volume vehicles and certain applications. There are ways around that. But it is still generally pretty expensive. So when we have seen some of these vehicles like the Nissan Micra, they went through all the same steps that would be required to sell that vehicle in the United States. They just never fully went through the process to actually send them to the dealer network here. This is a tricky question, Luke. Why all the hate about EVs in the United States? If I had an answer to that one, I probably would be a lot richer than I am. I don't really understand this one. My thought process on this is, if you don't want an EV, don't buy an EV. It's the same answer to, all the hot button topics, from gay marriage to abortion. If you're not a fan of gay marriage, don't get gay married. If you don't want an abortion, don't get one. That's the usual answer, right? If you don't like an EV, don't buy an EV. There are lots of other things to buy. I think there is this general fear that somehow or another there will be actual legislation that will require everything be an EV, and people are unsure about how that's going to fit in their lives. There's a lot of fear mongering. And because of these fears, there are people that will take advantage of those fears and try and set people apart to their own benefit, to their own end, etc. And that, I think, is rather unfortunate. Instead of diving in and saying, we have these problems, what can we do together? How can we work together to craft legislation or craft vehicles that will meet all of these demands and do it in a rational and sensible manner? We just have fear mongering and division. And that's just a human trait. It's a human quality. Set the other apart and do your thing. I would say, for the people that are seriously worried, and this is not a dismissal of people that are worried about what's going to happen when I can't buy a gasoline car, I don't have anywhere to charge it. These are rational worries. I live in the middle of nowhere. I don't have a lot of good charging publicly to charge, and I think this is a very rational concern. I have employees on the other side of the wall that don't own their home. They rent. Where are they going to charge? These are rational, valid concerns, but they're also concerns that could be addressed if everybody would bother to actually address the realistic concern instead of some fictional concern. And a lot of this, I think, comes into getting employers and companies out there to help provide charging and help be part of the solution. I'm not the biggest fan of tax incentives, et cetera, to corporations. I do not believe that corporations are people too. I think that's really stupid, but I do believe that there is a role for companies and employers to play in this. And people that are on the green bandwagon should be supportive of this. If you're looking at when green power happens during the day, when are we producing the most solar? When are we producing the most renewable energy? It's not 4 o'clock Pacific time. It's actually a little bit before, because demand is relatively low. Solar production is really ramping up quite nicely. And that's when we're not seeing a huge demand on the grid. That's exactly when EVs should charge. I actually have always been surprised by the number of people that are super happy that they're like, I'm super green. I charge my EV only at night, and that's when electricity is inexpensive. Yeah, it's inexpensive, but that's also when electricity is at its dirtiest, especially if you live in places that don't have a lot of renewable energy and don't have a lot of renewable energy storage. If you're in the Pacific Northwest, charge your EV at night. Doesn't matter. If you're in California, it's probably okay because there's a lot of renewable energy storage, and you can go to your utility and you can get 100% renewable energy. If you live in some other state, charging at night, probably not so green. And charging during the day is going to be more green, but you're at work. So you need to have your employer have some method of charging at the office. And whether that is a tax incentive or some government private partnership to help install more EV chargers, I think that's the most rational answer, circling back to the beginning of conversation, to where do people that don't live in a single family home, where do they charge? Where is this public charging infrastructure? I argue it's not at a mall. It shouldn't be unless you work at a mall, then hey, have it at the mall. But it shouldn't be on the street corner. It shouldn't be somewhere random. It shouldn't be at the back of Walmart. Again, unless you work at Walmart. It should be in every office park out there. It should be in the small to medium-sized businesses. It should be in every parking lot where you are doing your 9 to 5. That's where we need EV charging to exist. And by and large, we don't have that kind of charging infrastructure, even in California. We have a lot of investment done in, putting chargers at the grocery store or at the mall. That's lovely, but I don't know anybody that wants to go park at Safeway and then go walk a mile to the office. That's just stupid, right? You should be able to park outside, walk in the door, and sit at your desk and do your thing, and then walk back outside, unplug your car, and continue along. So that's my personal thought on the charging infrastructure there. And unfortunately, it is now 4 o'clock, so I will have to bid you adieu. You can post questions and comments down there in the comment section, and we will try and get to those in our next live show, which is not going to be next week. I have to tell you, there is a lot more travel going on in the month of June. And so we will see you all later. And at that point in time, Travis and Nick will probably be able to join us as well. So see all of you later. Have a great weekend and a great holiday weekend if you are living in the United States and you have Monday off. See all of you later.